The colony of Rhode Island in the year 1711 was a place of precarious order amidst a vast, untamed wilderness. The settlement of Providence Grove was one such pocket of civilization, a village of stern-faced farmers and God-fearing Puritans who had carved their existence from the stubborn soil at the edge of a vast, primordial swamp known as the Blackwater Mire. The mire was a place of shadows and secrets, of still black water and grasping roots, a realm the settlers avoided, seeing in its stagnant depths a reflection of the chaos they sought to conquer with their faith and their plows. On the very border between the cleared land and the encroaching swamp lived a man named Absalom Crow. He was a relic of an older time, a man who had come to the New World not for religious freedom, but for solitude. He lived in a ramshackle hut built on stilts, and the townsfolk viewed him with a mixture of pity and deep suspicion. They called him the Swamp Dweller, and they whispered that he consorted with the Pequot spirits and knew things no Christian man should. He was gaunt, with eyes the color of the peat-stained water, and he rarely spoke to anyone. The trouble began in the uncommonly wet spring of that year. The rains fell relentlessly, and the Blackwater Mire began to swell, its dark waters creeping further into the pasture land than ever before. One evening, as a group of villagers were reinforcing a boundary fence, Absalom Crow emerged from the mist. He pointed a bony finger, not at the sky, but at the very ground upon which their meeting house stood. "The earth groans beneath your pride," he intoned, his voice a dry rustle like dead leaves. "You build your houses on a grave. The Blackwater remembers the blood you spilled to claim this land. It will have its payment. Before the harvest moon fades, this village will fall, not to flame or sword, but to the water that sleeps beneath your feet. It will swallow your homes, your church, and your children. Providence Grove will be a memory, a story told to frighten fools who build on bones." The villagers were stunned into silence, then erupted in anger and derision. They drove him back to the swamp with curses and thrown stones, calling him a madman and a blasphemer. They trusted in their God and the strength of their own hands. They dismissed his words as the ravings of a lonely old man. But a seed of unease was planted. The prophecy was too specific, too terrible. And as the rains continued to fall and the mire continued to rise, that seed began to sprout tendrils of cold, creeping fear. A grim prophecy has been uttered on the edge of the Blackwater Mire. Absalom Crow, the mysterious swamp dweller, has foretold the complete destruction of Providence Grove by the very land upon which it stands. The villagers, secure in their faith, dismiss him as a lunatic, but the unending rains and the rising swamp waters give his words a terrifying weight. Is he a madman or a true oracle? And what is the bloody history of the land that he claims will be its undoing? The countdown to the harvest moon has begun. To follow the terrifying fulfillment of this prophecy, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell so you don't miss a moment of this chilling chronicle.
For weeks after Absalom's prophecy, life in Providence Grove continued, but the atmosphere was charged with a nervous tension. The Reverend Josiah Wickham preached fiery sermons against the sin of fear and the lies of false prophets, urging his flock to trust in divine providence. Yet the evidence of their senses worked against his words. The rain did not stop. The Blackwater Mire, usually a distant, brooding presence, was now a visible threat at the edge of their fields, its dark water lapping hungrily at the newly turned soil. Then the first tangible sign appeared. The main well in the center of the village, a source of clean, sweet water, began to yield a brackish, foul-tasting liquid. It smelled of rot and of the swamp. The earth around the wellhead grew soft and boggy. Within days, the well was unusable. The villagers had to trek to a stream further uphill, a costly and time-consuming endeavor. Then the ground itself began to change. The dirt roads, hardened by years of use, turned into quagmires of thick, clinging mud. The foundation of the meeting house, the proudest structure in the village, developed a crack, a jagged line that seemed to weep Blackwater. Gardens planted with corn and squash began to sink, the plants drowning in saturated earth. The animals sensed it first. Dogs whined and refused to leave their masters' sides. Livestock grew skittish, and several cows were lost when a section of pasture simply gave way, sucking them down into a sudden, bubbling sinkhole of black mud. The villagers worked frantically, building crude drainage ditches and reinforcing foundations, but it was like trying to bail out the ocean with a thimble. The water was not coming from the sky alone, it was seeping up from below, as if the entire village was built not on solid ground, but on a sponge filled with the Blackwater's essence. Absalom Crow's words echoed in their minds with every squelching step, with every new crack in their homes, the water that sleeps beneath your feet. The swamp dweller was not predicting a flood from the river. He was predicting that the ground would simply cease to be ground. The village was not going to be flooded. It was going to be reabsorbed. The prophecy is beginning to manifest in the most terrifying way possible. The very earth of Providence Grove is turning against its inhabitants, becoming a waterlogged, unstable nightmare. Wells are poisoned, foundations are cracking, and the land itself is swallowing livestock. The villagers' frantic efforts are proving useless against this subterranean assault. As the harvest moon draws nearer, panic begins to set in. Will the villagers finally heed the warning and flee, or will their pride and faith chain them to a sinking ship? The point of no return is rapidly approaching. To witness the village's desperate struggle and the next phase of the prophecy, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
As the days bled into weeks, the situation in Providence Grove deteriorated from a crisis to a full-blown catastrophe. The air grew thick with the stench of decay, a miasma that rose from the sodden ground and clung to clothes and hair. Illness began to spread, a racking cough and a debilitating fever the town's physician could not cure, blaming the bad air from the swamp. The social fabric of the community, once tightly woven by shared faith and purpose, began to fray. Accusations flew. Some whispered that the swamp dweller had cursed them. Others, more fearfully, began to believe his accusation that the land was founded on blood and that God was punishing them for the sins of their fathers. A faction led by Thomas Miller, a young, pragmatic farmer, went to Reverend Wickham. "Thomas, we must consider leaving," Miller pleaded, his face etched with worry. "The lower fields are gone. My barn leans like a drunkard. The Oracle, he may be right. The Mire wants its land back." Reverend Wickham, his own faith shaken by the relentless assault on his village, refused to entertain the notion. "To abandon our homes is to abandon the mission God set for us," he declared, though his voice lacked his former conviction. "This is Satan's work, testing us. We must not yield. We must pray harder." The debate was rendered moot on the night the harvest moon rose, a great, bloated orange disk in the hazy sky. It was the deadline of Absalom Crow's prophecy. The entire village was awake, huddled in their homes, listening. They expected a cataclysm, a great wave, an earthquake. What they got was worse. It began with a low, deep groaning sound that seemed to come from the very bowels of the earth. Then the ground began to move. It was not a shake,
but a slow, viscous churning. The meeting house, already cracked, let out a tortured shriek of timber and stone as its foundation gave way entirely, the back half of the structure sinking into the suddenly liquid earth, the great front door now opening onto a pool of bubbling black mud. Pandemonium erupted. The churning spread, a wave of liquefaction rolling through the village. Houses listed and collapsed. The graveyard vomited up its contents, coffins bobbing grotesquely in the morass. The villagers fled into the night, screaming, clutching their children, abandoning everything. They scrambled for the high ground, turning back only once to see their world being systematically unmade. By the dawn's gray light, Providence Grove was gone. Where homes and fields had stood was now a vast new extension of the Blackwater Mire, littered with the splintered wreckage of a community. The water that slept beneath their feet had awakened, and it had eaten them alive. Absalom Crow's prophecy had been fulfilled to the letter. The prophecy is complete. On the night of the harvest moon, the very earth of Providence Grove liquefied, swallowing homes, the meeting house, and the entire community in a slow, horrifying cataclysm. The survivors are now refugees, their world literally dissolved beneath them. But what of Absalom Crow? Was he mere a predictor, or was he the cause? And what is the deeper meaning of his words about blood spilled and the land remembering? The destruction of the village is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a much darker, more cyclical mystery. To discover the terrifying truth behind the Blackwater Oracle, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
The survivors of Providence Grove, shattered and traumatized, eventually regrouped. They saw the destruction not as a fulfillment of a swamp dweller's curse, but as a tragic natural disaster, a sinking of the earth. They were Puritans, a stubborn people. To flee entirely would be to admit defeat, to acknowledge that the swamp dweller had been right. And so, a mile further inland, on a rocky hill that seemed secure and dry, they founded a new settlement. They called it New Providence. They built their new meeting house with its back defiantly turned to the expanded Blackwater Mire, which now covered the grave of their old home. Years passed. The memory of Absalom Crow and his prophecy faded into a dark legend, a story to explain the strange, broken timbers that sometimes surfaced in the swamp. New Providence thrived. A new generation was born who knew the story of the sinking only as a tale from their grandparents' time. The swamp dweller himself was never seen again, presumed dead in the very catastrophe he had foretold. Then, in the spring of 1735, an old man emerged from the Blackwater Mire. He was gaunt, with eyes the color of peat water, and he looked exactly as Absalom Crow had 24 years before. He walked to the edge of New Providence and stood silently for a time, watching the new village. The few old-timers who saw him felt a cold dread seize their hearts. It was impossible. It had to be a descendant, a son, but the resemblance was uncanny. The new generation, curious and unburdened by the past, approached him. "Who are you, old man?" one asked. The man turned his ancient gaze upon the young farmer. "I am the memory of this place," he whispered, his voice the same dry rustle from a quarter-century past. He pointed a bony finger at the new meeting house. "You build on a hill, but the grave is still below. The Blackwater remembers. It is patient. Before the harvest moon fades, this village too will fall. It will swallow your homes, your church, and your children. New Providence will be a memory, a story told to frighten fools who build on bones." The words were identical. The prophecy was repeated, a perfect, horrifying echo. The old-timers fled in terror. The younger villagers, though unnerved, dismissed him as a madman, just as their parents had. They had built on solid rock. They were safe. But that year, the rains began again, and the Blackwater Mire, which had receded, began to slowly, inexorably creep toward the base of their hill. History is repeating itself with terrifying precision. A man who cannot possibly be the original Absalom Crow has emerged from the swamp to deliver the same prophecy to a new generation in a new village. The cycle of foundation and destruction is beginning again. Is this the same man, somehow ageless? Or is the Oracle Oracle a manifestation of the land's curse? New Providence, confident in its new location, ignores the warning, setting itself on the same doomed path as its predecessor. How can a curse be broken when its very nature is to reset and repeat? The investigation into the true nature of the Blackwater Oracle is about to begin. To follow the unraveling of this timeless mystery, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
The year is now 1789. Another generation, another village, Prospect Hill, now stands on the high ground, its inhabitants the grandchildren of the New Providence survivors. The legend of the swamp dweller and the sinking towns is a well-known fireside tale, a piece of local folklore largely divorced from fear. The current oracle has been seen, of course, an old man who appears every few decades to utter his doom-laden prophecy before disappearing back into the mire. The people of Prospect Hill pay him no mind. Their foundations are deep, their cellars dry. But one person listens. Eleanor Vance is the village teacher and the town's only true scholar, a woman whose intellect is matched only by her frustration with the willful ignorance of her neighbors. She has collected every scrap of history, every diary, every land deed related to the area. She sees the pattern not as a curse, but as a historical and geological problem to be solved. She believes the oracle is not a supernatural entity, but a human being, or a line of them, who understands a terrible truth about the land. Her research has led her to the original sin that Absalom Crow mentioned, the blood spilled. She discovered that before Providence Grove was founded, the land was a seasonal camping ground for the Narragansett people. A particularly zealous and greedy early settler, a man named Jeremiah Blackwood, who claimed the land grant, provoked a conflict that led to the massacre of a small, peaceful band of Narragansett, including their sachem and his family, on the very spot where the first meeting house was later built. The bodies were thrown into the swamp. The land was indeed founded on a grave. Eleanor theorizes that the oracle is a descendant of that slaughtered band, a keeper of the story, using the settlers' own superstitions against them. The oracle is not a sentient force of evil. It is an unstable peat bog, prone to massive, periodic liquefaction events, especially during periods of extreme rain. The Narragansett, who had lived there for centuries, would have known this and avoided building permanent structures on that specific, treacherous ground. The oracle doesn't cause the sinkings, he simply knows when they are due to happen again. And he uses the prophecy to terrorize the descendants of the man who murdered his ancestors. It is a campaign of psychological warfare that has lasted for generations. Eleanor Vance has pierced the veil of superstition. The Blackwater Oracle is not a ghost or a demon, but a human agent of vengeance using hidden geological knowledge as a weapon. The prophecy is a brilliantly cruel hoax that preys on the guilt and fear of the settlers' descendants. But knowing the truth is only half the battle. How can she prove it? And how can she stop the current cycle before Prospect Hill suffers the same fate as its predecessors? The next appearance of the Oracle will be her only chance to break the chain. To see how Eleanor plans to confront the legend, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
Eleanor Vance did not have to wait long. An unseasonably wet spring gave way to a sodden summer. The water table rose and the Blackwater Mire swelled, its dark waters licking at the lower slopes of Prospect Hill. The air grew heavy and tense. The old stories were whispered in the tavern once more. And then he appeared, the Oracle. He emerged from the twilight mist at the swamp's edge, a gaunt figure in a tattered cloak, his presence causing a ripple of fear through the watching villagers. This time, Eleanor was ready. She did not hide or tremble. She walked down the hill alone, meeting him halfway between the solid ground of the village and the shifting mire. The villagers watched, breathless, from a distance. The Oracle raised his bony arm, his mouth opening to begin the familiar litany of doom. "I know who you are," Eleanor said, her voice clear and steady, cutting him off before he could speak. The Oracle paused, his ancient eyes narrowing at her. "Your name is not Absalom Crow. Absalom Crow was the first. He was a trapper who learned the truth from the Narragansett woman he loved, the one who survived Jeremiah Blackwood's massacre. He was the first to use the knowledge as a weapon. You were his descendant. You were the keeper of the story, and you were the keeper of the calendar." The Oracle was silent, but a flicker of surprise in his eyes confirmed her theory. "You know the cycles of the bog. You know that every few decades the conditions are right for a massive liquefaction event. The prophecy is not magic, it is geology. You don't cause the sinking, you just take credit for it." For the first time in living memory, the Oracle spoke words that were not his scripted prophecy. "They built on bones," he rasped, his voice filled with a hatred that was very human and very old. "They built on murder. The land rejects them. It is justice." "It is a tragedy repeating itself," Eleanor countered. "You terrorize people who had nothing to do with Blackwood's crime. You let them drown in the mud to avenge a murder from a century ago. Where is the justice in that?" She took a step closer, holding out a sheaf of papers. Her research, the land deeds, the historical accounts. "The truth is here. The story of the massacre. The story of your people. Let me tell it. Let me have Blackwood's name stricken from the founder's plaque and the true history put in its place. Let there be a memorial. Let there be acknowledgement. Stop this cycle of vengeance. Give us the knowledge to live with this land, not die on it." She was offering a truce. Not forgiveness, but truth. The Oracle stared at her, his face an unreadable mask of age and bitterness. The weight of generations hung in the air between them. He had the power to let the prophecy stand, to watch another village be punished for the sins of its great-grandfathers. Or he could break the cycle, and in doing so, allow the true story of his people to finally be heard. Eleanor Vance has thrown a torch into the engine of the curse by revealing the Oracle's true nature and offering acknowledgement instead of fear. She has presented a path out of the endless cycle. The power is now in the Oracle's hands. Will he cling to his ancestral vengeance, or will he accept her offer of historical justice? The decision he makes in this moment will determine the fate of Prospect Hill and end a war that has been fought in shadows and sinkholes for nearly a century. The fate of the village hangs on the conscience of a vengeful ghost made flesh. To witness the Oracle's shocking decision, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
The silence stretched, thick and heavy as the swamp air. The Oracle's gaze shifted from Eleanor's face to the papers in her hand, then to the watching villagers on the hill, their faces pale with a fear he had cultivated for generations. He saw not the arrogant settlers of old, but frightened people, most of whom had never heard the name Jeremiah Blackwood. The pure, sharp blade of his hatred, honed over 80 years, was suddenly blunted by the complexity Eleanor presented. He looked back at her, his eyes still ancient, but now they held a flicker of something else. Exhaustion. The burden of being a living curse was immense. He said, "The water comes," he said, his voice low, but this time it was not a prophecy of doom, but a statement of fact. "The ground beneath the western field, it is already soup beneath a thin crust. It will go first. Then the road. You have 2 days, maybe 3. It was a different kind of prophecy, a warning. He was giving them the knowledge they needed to survive. He was breaking the cycle. He then reached into his cloak and pulled out a small, worn leather pouch. He handed it to Eleanor. He said, "The story is in here. The true story, written in the hand of Absalom Crow. Tell it." Without another word, he turned and melted back into the shadows of the Blackwater Mire, not as a terrifying omen, but as a man returning to a long, lonely vigil. He would not be seen again. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, then turned and ran up the hill, shouting to the stunned villagers, "He's given us a warning! The western field is going to go! We have to evacuate! Now!" This time, with the specific, tangible warning and the authority of the Oracle himself behind it, the people listened. Panic, yes, but a purposeful panic. They had a chance. For the next 48 hours, Prospect Hill was a frenzy of organized retreat. Belongings were packed onto carts. Livestock was driven to safety. People moved to the highest, easternmost point of the hill or to neighboring farms. And just as the Oracle had warned, on the 3rd day, the western field simply collapsed in on itself, a great slurping sinkhole of black mud that swallowed fences and a storage shed. The main road followed, crumbling away into the expanding mire. But the village itself, the homes on the solid bedrock of the hill's crest, were spared. Prospect Hill was wounded, but it had not fallen. The prophecy had been fulfilled, but its outcome had been changed. The cycle was broken. The Oracle has chosen a path of tragic redemption. By providing a specific warning, he has saved Prospect Hill from total destruction, breaking the chain of vengeance that began with Jeremiah Blackwood. The village is saved, but the land has still reclaimed its due. The curse is not ended, but its nature has been transformed from a supernatural punishment into a manageable geological fact. Eleanor now holds the true history in her hands. The final chapter is one of reconciliation and the long, difficult work of building a future that acknowledges a bloody past. To see how the legacy of the Blackwater Oracle is finally laid to rest, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
In the aftermath of the partial sinking, the mood in Prospect Hill was not one of triumph, but of sober reflection. They had been saved not by divine intervention, but by the mercy of a man they had been taught to fear, acting on knowledge they had dismissed as superstition. Eleanor Vance became the central figure in the village's reckoning. She gathered the town in the meeting house, the same building whose predecessors had sunk twice before, and she read aloud from the papers in the worn leather pouch. It was the journal of Absalom Crow. It told the story not from the settler's perspective, but from the swamp's edge. It described his love for a Narragansett woman named Mateen, Morning Star, who had survived the massacre by hiding in the water, holding her breath as her family was slaughtered. It described how she showed him the secret rhythms of the Blackwater Mire, which of its grounds were solid and which were death traps that would liquefy with the rains. It described Jeremiah Blackwood's cruelty and the town's complicit silence. When Mateen died of a fever years later, a broken woman, Absalom's grief turned to a cold, calculated rage. He created the persona of the Oracle. He would use the settlers' own fear of the wilderness and their hidden guilt to punish them. He would make the land itself seem to rise up in judgment. He taught his children, and they taught theirs, the cycles of the bog and the performance of the prophecy. The reading of the journal was a profound and shaming experience for the village. The ghost story had a human face, and it was a face twisted by a grief they had caused. A motion was put forward and passed unanimously. The founder's plaque in the meeting house, which listed Jeremiah Blackwood as a visionary leader, was taken down. In its place, a new plaque was commissioned, detailing the true history of the land, the massacre, and the story of Mateen and Absalom Crow. The western sinkhole was not filled. It was fenced off and left as a permanent memorial and a warning. The village would learn to live with the mire, respecting its boundaries and its power. Eleanor Vance ensured that the story was taught in her school. The legend of the Blackwater Oracle was no longer a tale of a scary swamp ghost, but a complex lesson about historical injustice, the consequences of land theft, and the terrifying power of a story to shape reality for generations. The Oracle had finally achieved his goal. The truth was known, but the victory was bittersweet, paid for with the lives of 2 villages and the soul of a family forced to become avenging spirits for a century. The full tragic truth has been revealed, transforming the legend of the Blackwater Oracle from a supernatural curse into a human story of love, loss, and vengeance. Prospect Hill has chosen to integrate this painful history into its identity, creating memorials and changing its foundational narrative. The cycle of destruction has been broken, replaced by a fragile peace built on acknowledgement and respect. But what is the ultimate fate of the Oracle's bloodline? And how does a community move forward when its foundation is literally and figuratively unstable? The story now moves to its conclusion, exploring the long-term legacy of this reckoning. To understand the final echo of the Oracle's prophecy, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the next chapter.
Generations passed. Prospect Hill endured, its population growing and changing. The story of the Blackwater Oracle and the sinking villages became a fundamental part of the local history, recorded in books and taught to every child. The great western sinkhole, now overgrown with hardy marsh plants, was known as the Remembering, a permanent scar on the landscape that kept the past alive. The town learned to build with the land, not against it, using the knowledge hard-won from tragedy. The role of the Oracle faded into history. There were no more gaunt old men emerging from the mire with prophecies of doom. The vengeance was complete. The truth was out. The Crow bloodline, it was believed, had died out, its purpose fulfilled. The Blackwater Mire was still a place of mystery and danger, but it was now a subject of scientific study as well as folklore. Geologists came and confirmed Eleanor Vance's theories, mapping the unstable peat bogs and advising on land use. Yet, the memory required a keeper. This role fell not to a vengeful descendant, but to the town itself, and in particular, to the descendants of Eleanor Vance, who became the unofficial historians and conservationists of the area. They maintained the memorials, they told the story with all its complexity, and they fought to protect the Blackwater Mire from developers who saw only worthless swamp. They understood that the mire was not just a geological feature, it was a grave, a monument, and a teacher. The curse of the Oracle was ultimately not about sinking villages. It was about the danger of forgetting. The land had a history, a violent, painful history, and when the settlers built their first village on top of that history without acknowledgement, they created a wound that festered for a century. The Oracle was the symptom of that festering wound. By finally acknowledging the truth, the community allowed the wound to heal. The land would always be unstable, but the people were now stable in their understanding of it. They had made peace with the ghost, not by exorcising it, but by listening to its story. The immediate drama is over, but the legacy of the Blackwater Oracle endures as a powerful lesson in historical memory and environmental respect. The curse has been transformed into a cornerstone of the community's identity. The figure of the Oracle is no longer a threat, but a tragic character in the town's foundational story. The cycle of destruction has been transformed into a cycle of remembrance. But does the land itself ever truly forget? The final reflection on this story brings us to the present day, to the quiet, enduring power of place. To hear the concluding thoughts on the Oracle of Blackwater, subscribe to the channel and hit the bell for the final chapter.
Today, the area around the Blackwater Mire is a protected state reserve. Hikers can walk well-marked trails that carefully skirt the unstable ground. There is a small museum in what was once Prospect Hill, now a modern town, which tells the intertwined stories of the Narragansett people, the settlers, and the Oracle. The central exhibit is the worn leather pouch and the journal of Absalom Crow. The true legacy of the Blackwater Oracle is the understanding that the past is not dead. It is simply buried, and like the water-saturated peat of the mire, it can liquefy and rise to the surface with tremendous force if placed under enough pressure. The pressure of ignored history, of unacknowledged sin, is the most volatile of all. The Oracle's prophecy was a self-fulfilling one, not through magic, but through the mechanics of human psychology and geology. By believing in the curse, by building on land they knew was stained with blood, the settlers made themselves vulnerable to the very real periodic collapse of the ground beneath them. The story endures because it is a perfect allegory. We all build our lives on land with a history. Societies are constructed upon foundations of conquest, injustice, and forgotten violence. The Blackwater Oracle teaches that those foundations are never entirely solid.
The ghosts of the past do not need to be real to have power. They only need to be forgotten. The only way to stabilize the ground is to acknowledge what lies beneath, to give the past a voice, and to build our future not on the arrogant assumption that the ground is forever firm, but on the humble knowledge that we are all temporary tenants on a land that remembers everything. The oracle's final, greatest prophecy was this: that a story once told can never be unsaid. It will sink into the collective memory like water into peat, and it will wait there, patient and heavy, until the conditions are right for it to arise again, shaping the world for generations to come. The question is not whether the past will speak, but whether we will have the courage to listen before the ground gives way beneath our feet. The saga of the Blackwater Oracle is a journey into the heart of a historical and environmental mystery. It reveals that the most terrifying curses are not supernatural, but are born from real-world crimes and willful ignorance. The true horror was the massacre and its cover-up. The sinking villages were merely the symptom. The resolution came not from defeating a ghost, but from embracing a painful truth. This story challenges us to look at the land we live on and ask, what history have we buried? And what price will we pay for forgetting? If you are drawn to the deepest and most dramatic stories of history, to the moments where the past confronts the present, then your search for understanding continues with us. Subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. We are always exploring the darkest corners of history and the human experience.